My father thought suspending me was a leash, and my sister believed a fake apology would hand her the company my mother built. When I stood in that glass room and said, "All right," they thought they had won. By the next morning, my sister watched men in suits remove boxes labeled with her name. I did not scream. I simply signed a document from the past and stopped saving people who mistook my competence for a duty to sacrifice. My name is Adeline Bryan, and the moment my life as I knew it ended, the air conditioning in the executive conference room was humming at a frequency that vibrated in my molars. I stood at the head of the mahogany table, my fingertips resting lightly on the polished wood, looking at a room full of people who were actively trying not to look at me. The projector screen behind me had frozen on slide 14, a quarterly projection chart that was pixelated into a blur of blue and gray, hanging there like a technological ghost that refused to move on. The light in the room was that specific, high Kelvin white that corporations use to simulate daylight, but only succeeds in making human skin look like parchment. Everyone looked like statues carved from anxiety and expensive wool blends. At the far end of the table sat my father, Gregory Bryan. He did not look like a man who was about to execute his eldest daughter. He looked calm. He looked reasonable. He placed his fountain pen down on the legal pad in front of him, aligning it perfectly parallel with the edge of the table. It was a Mont Blanc I had bought him for his 60th birthday, a detail that stung more than I expected it to. He folded his hands. The movement was slow, deliberate, and practiced. "You are suspended. Adeline," he said. The words did not come out as a shout. They were not delivered with the fire and brimstone of a patriarch scorned. They were spoken with a terrifying, bureaucratic flatness. It was a tone devoid of blood. "Effective immediately," he continued, his eyes meeting mine with a heavy, performative sadness. "You are suspended until you offer a sincere and public apology to your sister." I shifted my gaze to the right, where Lena sat. My sister, Lena Bryan, was leaned back in her ergonomic leather chair. Her posture a study in victimhood. She had positioned herself slightly away from the table, as if the mere proximity to my professional existence was physically painful for her. She wore a suit that cost more than the average sedan in Ashford Ridge, a soft cream color that made her look innocent, angelic even. Her head was bowed slightly, her hand resting on her forehead as if nursing a migraine brought on by my alleged incompetence. But I saw it. It was a micro-expression, fleeting and sharp as a paper cut. The corner of her mouth twitched upward. It was not a smile of joy. It was a smile of confirmation. It was the look of a gambler who had just watched the dice stop rolling exactly where she had willed them to. She was enjoying the theater of it. She was the star. Gregory was the director, and I was the villain written out of the script in the third act. I recognized the atmosphere in the room. It was thick with a specific kind of silence I had known my entire life. It was the silence of the Bryan household dinner table when something unpleasant had to be swallowed. Gregory cleared his throat, addressing the 6 other board members who were currently finding the grain of the wood table fascinating. "This is not a decision I make lightly," he told them, his voice dropping an octave into his concerned leader register. "But we have to think about the image of Heliovantage systems. We are at a critical juncture with the Harbor Point account. We cannot afford internal friction. We cannot afford mixed messaging." He paused, letting the weight of his disappointment settle on my shoulders. "Lena tells me that your behavior during the site walk yesterday was unacceptable. Adeline, she says you openly contradicted her strategy in front of the client. You questioned her timelines. You undermined her authority. You damaged the credibility of this firm." I felt the accusation hit me, but I did not flinch. I did not blink. The board members shifted in their seats. Marjorie Hale, the oldest member of the board, and a woman who used to drink tea with my mother, adjusted her glasses and looked at the pitcher of water in the center of the table. She knew the truth. They all knew the truth. They knew that Lena was the rainmaker, the one who promised clients the moon, the stars, and a fully integrated operating system in 3 months. They also knew I was the executioner, the one who stayed in the office until 3 a.m. making sure the code actually worked, the one who had to explain that physics and mathematics did not bend to marketing slogans. But in the ecosystem of Heliovantage, Lena brought in the checks, and I was just the overhead. I was the friction. I was the killjoy who brought spreadsheets to a champagne party. Gregory looked at me, waiting. He was waiting for the script to play out. He expected me to argue. He expected me to flush red, to stammer about engineering constraints, to pull out my data logs and prove that Lena's timeline was a fantasy that would bankrupt us in penalties. He expected me to be the difficult one, the rigid one. That was the dynamic he had cultivated since we were children. Lena was the dreamer. I was the obstacle. Lena was fragile and needed protection. I was strong and needed to be reasonable. Just apologize. Adeline, he said, his voice softening into that paternal trap I knew so well. It is for the good of the family. It is for the good of the company. Just put your ego aside and we can move past this. For the family? The phrase hung in the recycled air. It was the same phrase he used when he missed my graduation because Lena had a dance recital. It was the same phrase he used when he took the credit for the back-end overhaul I spent 2 years building. I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the lines around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hand that he tried to hide. I saw a man who was terrified of his youngest daughter's tantrums and completely indifferent to his eldest daughter's labor. My eyes drifted down to the agenda pad that sat in front of the empty chair next to me. It belonged to the CFO, who was out sick. The paper was upside down, but I had spent enough years reading upside-down schematics to decipher it instantly. There, at the very bottom of the page, in small, unassuming text, was Item 7. Leadership restructuring and reallocation of Chief Technical Officer duties. The air left my lungs, but not in a gasp. It left slowly, silently. I was the Chief Technical Officer. This meeting was not about an apology. The suspension was not a disciplinary measure to teach me a lesson about teamwork. It was a transition. They were not waiting for me to apologize so I could come back. They were waiting for me to apologize so they could strip me of my power while I was on my knees. The apology was not the goal. It was the mechanism of my surrender. If I argued, I looked unstable. If I apologized, I admitted fault. Either way, Item 7 would pass. They had already counted the votes. They had already printed the new organizational charts. I looked back at Lena. She risked a glance at me, her eyes wide with faux concern, waiting for me to explode. She wanted the explosion. She needed me to be the villain one last time, so she could be the hero who stepped in to save the day. A strange sensation washed over me. It was cold, like standing in a walk-in freezer, but it brought with it a crystalline clarity. I stopped caring. It was not a gradual process. It was instantaneous. It was the snapping of a cable that had been pulled too tight for 30 years. The desire to prove myself, the need to be the good daughter, the compulsion to save the company from its own incompetence, it all simply evaporated. I looked at the frozen slide on the screen. I looked at Marjorie Hale refusing to meet my eyes. I looked at my father, who was watching me with a mixture of impatience and pity. I realized then that I was the only person in the room who actually understood how the products we sold worked. I was the only one who knew the password to the root server. I was the only one who knew that the Harbor Point architecture was currently held together by a patch I wrote 3 weeks ago that required daily maintenance. They thought they were firing an employee. They did not realize they were removing the load-bearing wall of the entire building. "Adeline?" my father prompted, his tone sharpening. "Did you hear me?" I took a breath. The air tasted like ozone and betrayal. "All right," I said. The word hung there, simple and devastating. It was not the reaction they wanted. Gregory blinked. Lena sat up straighter, her brow furrowing. They were prepared for a fight. They were prepared for tears. They were prepared for a 20-minute speech about fairness and logic. They were not prepared for indifference. "Excuse me?" Gregory asked, leaning forward. I said all right, I repeated. My voice was steady. It was not the voice of a daughter speaking to her father. It was the voice of a stranger speaking to a clerk. I reached out and closed the laptop in front of me. The sound of the lid snapping shut echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. I picked up my phone. I picked up my security badge. "You are accepting the suspension?" Gregory asked, looking confused. He had expected to have to browbeat me into submission. He did not know what to do with a surrender that arrived before the battle had even begun. "I am," I said. I pulled the leather chair back and stood up. I smoothed the front of my blazer. I looked at Lina. For the first time, the mask slipped. The smugness wavered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. She had won. But it felt wrong. It was too easy. She was like a cat that had pounced on a laser pointer only to find there was nothing beneath its paws. I looked at the board members. Now they were looking at me. They looked unsettled. Perhaps they were realizing that the woman who handled every crisis, every server crash, and every technical disaster was walking away without a backward glance. "When do you think you will be ready to apologize?" Gregory asked, trying to regain control of the narrative. He wanted a timeline. He wanted to schedule my humiliation. I did not answer him. I simply turned toward the glass doors. "Adeline," my father called out, his voice rising, cracking the professional veneer. "We are not finished here. You cannot just walk out." I stopped at the door. I could see my reflection in the glass. I looked calm. I looked relieved. I pushed the heavy glass door open. "I think we are finished, Gregory," I said, dropping the title of father entirely. I walked out into the hallway. The carpet dampened the sound of my heels. Behind me, the silence in the conference room was absolute. It was a vacuum. They were all still sitting there, frozen under the white lights, trapped in a room with a frozen projector and a company that was already dead, even if they did not know it yet. As I walked toward the elevator, I did not feel sad. I did not feel angry. I felt light. I checked my watch. It was 10 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday. I pressed the down button. Behind me, inside the glass fishbowl, I saw Lina turn to Gregory and say something, her hands gesturing wildly. She was starting to panic. Good. She should be. The elevator doors opened with a cheerful chime. I stepped inside and let the doors slide shut, cutting off the view of the people who had spent my entire life telling me I was not enough. Right up until the moment I decided I was finished being everything for them. The silence in the elevator was not new to me. I had been living inside a variation of that silence since I was 11 years old. It was a silence that smelled of lemon polish and unsaid resentments, the specific atmosphere of the Bryan household in Ashford Ridge. I remember the day the dynamic was permanently set in stone. It was a Tuesday afternoon, raining hard enough to rattle the gutters. Lina was 9, and I was 11. We were in the living room, surrounded by construction paper and glue sticks for a school project we were supposed to be sharing. I had already done the research, printed the images, and outlined the text. All I asked Lina to do was cut out the shapes. She cut one, got bored, and reached for the remote control. When I took the remote away and told her we had to finish, she did not argue. She did not yell. She simply opened her mouth and let out a wail that sounded like physical injury. It was a performance art piece, instant and piercing. My father, Gregory, came running down the stairs as if the house were on fire. He did not look at the table. He did not look at the work I had done. He went straight to Lina, scooping her up onto the sofa, shushing her as she buried her dry face in his shirt. "What did you do to her?" he asked, looking at me over her shoulder. His eyes were not angry, which would have been easier to handle. They were disappointed. I explained that I just wanted her to do her share. I explained that it was a group grade. Gregory sighed, the sound of a man burdened by the complexities of women. "Adeline," he said, his voice dropping to that reasonable, teaching tone. "Lina is sensitive. You know that. She feels things deeply. You are the older sister. You are stronger." He smoothed Lina's hair as she peeked out at me with a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. "You have to be the reasonable one. Adeline," he continued, "it is not about who is right. It is about keeping the peace. Be the bigger person." That was the contract signed that afternoon. I would trade my reality for his peace. I picked up the scissors and finished the project alone while they watched cartoons. Later that night, my door opened. It was my mother, Elise. My mother was a woman of quiet force, the kind of person who could run a company with a glance but chose to run a home with a touch. She sat on the edge of my bed, the mattress dipping under her weight. She did not turn on the big light, just the small lamp on my desk where my finished homework lay in a neat stack. "I know," she said softly. She did not ask what happened. She witnessed everything, always. She reached out and took my hand. Her fingers were cool and dry. "Your father sees the world in pictures, Adeline," she told me. "He sees the smiles, the hugs, the moments that look good in a frame. He does not see the scaffolding that holds it up." She brushed a strand of hair behind my ear. "Some people are born loud," she said. "They take up all the air in the room because they are terrified that if they stop making noise, they will disappear. That is your sister. But some people are born steady, like the earth. People walk all over the earth, Adeline, and they forget it is there, but without it, they would fall through space." It was the first time someone had framed my invisibility as a superpower. From then on, I watched the divergence grow. I saw it in the way Gregory operated. If Lena did a pirouette in the living room, Gregory was there with a camcorder, cheering, calling her a natural talent. If I stayed up until midnight scrubbing the kitchen counters because the housekeeper was sick, Gregory would walk in the next morning, pour his coffee, and never notice the lack of stains. He assumed the house cleaned itself. He assumed the grades on my report card just happened. He assumed I required no maintenance. When I was 14, I was accepted into a competitive STEM summer program at a university 3 states away. It was prestigious, the kind of thing that builds careers. I was bursting to tell them at dinner, but before I could speak, Lena dropped her fork and announced she had been given a solo in the community choir. Gregory spent 40 minutes talking about her voice, about how special she was, about how we needed to invite the whole neighborhood. I ate my peas and never mentioned the acceptance letter. That night, I found a small envelope under my pillow. Inside was a single sheet of heavy cream stationery and a thin silver bracelet. It was not flashy, it was delicate, almost industrial in its simplicity. My mother's handwriting was slanted and sharp. "Wear this when you build something bigger than all of this," the note read. I put the bracelet on. I twisted it around my wrist, feeling the cool metal against my pulse. It felt like armor. 2 years later, the silence in the house changed texture. It went from the silence of suppression to the silence of loss. Elise died in the autumn. It was a swift, brutal illness that stripped the house of its color. With her gone, the buffer was removed. There was no one left to translate me to my father. There was no one left to tell him that my silence was not agreement, but endurance. After the funeral, the house was filled with flowers that smelled like decay. I was in the hallway, carrying a tray of untouched food back to the kitchen, when I saw the family lawyer, Mr. Henderson, standing at the door of my father's study. He was handing Gregory a thick, sealed manila envelope. "This is for Adeline," Mr. Henderson said. "Elise was very specific. She wanted her to have this immediately." I stopped, breathing shallowly, waiting for my father to call my name. Gregory took the envelope. He looked at it for a long moment. He looked at the closed door of the living room where Lena was sobbing loudly into the shoulder of an aunt, absorbing the room's entire supply of sympathy. He did not call me. He opened his desk drawer, the bottom one where he kept old tax returns and things he did not want to deal with, and he dropped the envelope inside. He slid the drawer shut with a soft click. I stood in the hallway, the tray trembling in my hands. I did not go in. I did not demand it. I had been trained too well. Be reasonable. Adeline, not now. He is grieving. In the months that followed, Gregory adopted a new mantra. Whenever the grief became too sharp, or whenever the business stress leaked into the house, he would gather us, mostly Lena, and say, "We only have each other. Family is everything. Family comes first." But in the mathematics of Gregory Bryan, family meant Lena. Prioritizing the family meant protecting Lena from reality. I became a ghost in my own life, to fill the void my mother left, and to escape the suffocating demand to be the emotional anchor for a father who ignored me. I turned to the only thing that made sense: the company. Helio Vantage Systems became my sanctuary. While other teenagers were going to movies or dating, I was taking the bus to the industrial park where the headquarters stood. I told Gregory I was just helping out, and he nodded vaguely, happy that I was occupied and not demanding his attention. I started in the archives. I organized 10 years of chaotic paper trails. Then I moved to inventory, then data entry. I sat in the back rooms, the supply closets converted into makeshift offices, surrounded by the hum of servers and the smell of ozone. I found comfort in the binary. Zeros and ones did not have favorites. Code did not cry to get its way. A spreadsheet balance was either true or false. It could not be manipulated by a tearful performance. I remember one late afternoon vividly. I was 16. I was sitting in a windowless storage room, lit only by the blue glow of a monitor, manually reconciling a shipping error that had cost the company $5,000. My fingers flew across the number pad. I was tired. My eyes burned. But I felt useful. I felt solid. The door to the hallway was cracked open slightly. I heard laughter. I leaned back and looked through the gap. Lena was walking through the main lobby. She was 14, glowing with health and expensive skincare. She had 3 friends with her. She was pointing at the logo on the wall, a silver sunburst. "My daddy built this," she chirped, her voice echoing off the marble floors I had watched the janitors polish. "Basically, I own this place. I am the future face of Helio Vantage." Her friends giggled, looking at her with adoration. Gregory walked out of his office then. He saw her. He did not scold her for disturbing the workplace. He beamed. He walked over and put his arm around her, waving at her friends like a benevolent king. "See this?" he said to the group, squeezing Lena's shoulder. "This is my inspiration. This is why I work so hard." I looked down at my hands. They were stained with toner ink. I touched the silver bracelet on my wrist. I went back to the spreadsheet. I typed in the final correction and hit enter. The error was resolved. The money was saved. No one would ever know I did it, and for the first time, I realized that was exactly how I was going to survive them. I would become the foundation they walked on, deeper and harder than they could imagine, until the day I decided to shift. My official title on the Human Resources Manifest was Software Development Specialist. It was a generic, mid-level designation that suggested I spent my days fixing printer drivers and rebooting routers. It was a title designed to be invisible, paid a salary that was respectable but hardly executive, and placed on a rung of the corporate ladder that usually led to nowhere. In reality, I was the architect of the entire machine. When I first formally joined the payroll, the engineering department was 3 guys in a basement room that smelled of mildew and despair. They were maintaining legacy code that was older than I was, patching holes in a sinking ship with digital duct tape. I took over a forgotten corner of the 4th floor, a space that had previously been used to store broken office furniture and holiday decorations. I stripped it down. I installed proper ventilation. I set up server racks that hummed with a rhythm I could feel in the soles of my shoes. Over 5 years, I built a team. I hired engineers who had been overlooked by the big tech firms because they did not interview well or did not have the right pedigree. I taught them that code was not just functional, it was structural. We built the backbone of Helio Vantage Systems. Every login, every data transfer, every secure transaction that our clients relied on ran through the architecture I designed. My team trusted me because I did not manage them from a spreadsheet. I managed them from the terminal. I knew every line of code. I knew exactly how long a migration would take. I knew when a deadline was a challenge and when it was a death march. Then Lena returned. She came back to the company after a brief, underwhelming stint in fashion marketing in New York, sweeping into the office with a new title created specifically for her, Director of Strategic Relations. She did not know how to code. She could not read a API documentation if her life depended on it, but she knew how to wear silk blouses that caught the light And she knew how to order wine at lunch. And she knew how to make a client feel like the smartest person in the room. My father, Gregory, was ecstatic. He finally had the partner he had always wanted. He began taking Lena to every industry conference, every gala, every high-stakes dinner. He introduced her as the face of the brand, the fresh energy of Heliovantage. When clients asked about the technical side, he would wave a hand vaguely toward the back office and mention that I was the operational brain, a phrase he used to make me sound like a piece of equipment rather than a person. He never invited me to the stage. I was the engine room. Lena was the figurehead. I did not fight for the spotlight. Instead, I started writing things down. It began as a defense mechanism. I realized early on that Lena's primary skill was promising things that did not exist. She would sit in a meeting with a potential partner and agree to features we had never tested. Timelines that defied the laws of physics, and budgets that were purely theoretical. So, I created a system. For every project, I produced a shadow document. While Lena had her glossy pitch decks with stock photos of smiling people shaking hands, I had the project scope reality assessment. I listed every technical requirement. I calculated the man-hours down to the decimal point. I mapped out the risk factors in red ink. I did not do this to be difficult. I did it because I was the only person in the building who seemed to understand that if you promise a client a skyscraper in 3 weeks, the building will fall down. The breaking point came with the North Star Logistics contract. It was a massive deal, the kind that gets written up in the business journals. Lena had been courting their CEO for months. During the final closing dinner, a night where I was at home eating takeout and debugging a database error, Lena promised them a full system rollout in 3 months. 3 months! For a system integration of that magnitude, with legacy data migration and security compliance protocols, the absolute minimum viable timeline was 9 months. When the signed contract landed on my desk the next morning, I felt the blood drain from my face. I walked into Gregory's office with my charts. I showed him the math. I explained that to hit a 3-month deadline, the engineering team would have to work 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, and we would still likely launch with critical bugs. Gregory waved me off. "You are being negative." "Adeline," he said, adjusting his tie in the reflection of his window. "Lena closed the deal. That is the hard part. Your job is just to make it happen. Figure it out." So I did. I did not sleep more than 4 hours a night for 12 weeks. I moved a cot into my office. I ordered dinner for my team every single night on my own credit card because Gregory refused to approve the overtime meal budget. I sat side by side with my junior developers, rewriting entire libraries of code to bypass bottlenecks. I became the shield between my team and the impossible expectations of my family. I caught the errors before they became disasters. I streamlined the protocols. We launched on day 89. The system held. It was ugly on the back end, a tangled mess of patches and bypasses that would need a year to fix properly, but the user interface was clean, and the data flowed. At the celebration party held in the main atrium, Gregory stood on a podium with a microphone. The North Star executives were there, clinking glasses of champagne. "I want to propose a toast," Gregory boomed, his face flushed with pride. "To the person who made this possible. To the visionary who saw the potential of this partnership and refused to take no for an answer. To my daughter, Lena." The room erupted in applause. Lena stepped forward, beaming, looking radiant in a sapphire dress. She took the microphone and talked about synergy and drive and the power of believing in a goal. She gestured to the room and said, "I could not have done it without my team," a phrase that sounded gracious but felt like theft. I stood in the back, near the catering kitchen doors. I was wearing the same gray blazer I had worn for 3 days. My eyes were burning from exhaustion. I held a glass of sparkling water that had gone warm. I watched them. I watched my father look at her with an adoration that he had never, not once, directed at me. But I was not the only one watching. Marjorie Hale, the board member who always wore severe spectacles and pearls, was standing near the bar. She was not looking at Lena. She was looking at the stack of technical compliance reports that had been distributed to the board that morning. She was looking at the signature on the bottom of every single page. Prepared by Adeline Bryan, Chief Technical Officer. Reviewed by Adeline Bryan. Authorized by Adeline Bryan. Marjorie looked up from the papers and caught my eye across the room. She did not smile. She simply nodded, a barely perceptible dip of her chin. It was an acknowledgement. She saw the discrepancy. She saw who was wearing the crown and who was carrying the stone. That night, I went back to my office to start the cleanup of the code. My inbox was full. It was not full of congratulations. It was full of alerts from headhunters. Recruiters from San Francisco, Seattle, and Austin had found me. They knew. In the small, tight-knit world of back-end engineering, word travels. They knew who had actually pulled off the North Star migration. The emails offered salaries that were double what Gregory paid me. They offered stock options. They offered titles like Vice President of Engineering. They offered a life where I would be respected for what I built, not who I was related to. I hovered my mouse over the reply button on an email from a major cloud computing firm in Seattle. It would be so easy. I could pack my bags. I could leave the toxic gravity of the Bryan family. But then I looked at my wrist. I touched the thin silver bracelet my mother had given me. Wear this when you build something bigger than all of this. This company was not just Gregory's vanity project. It was my mother's legacy. She had been the one who filed the incorporation papers. She had been the one who managed the books in the early days when Gregory was too busy dreaming to pay the electric bill. Leaving felt like abandoning her. It felt like handing the last piece of her over to Lena to destroy. I deleted the emails. I archived the offers. I chose to stay in the burning house because I was the only one holding a bucket of water. However, something hardened in me that night. Every time Lena walked a client through the office and waved a manicured hand at the glass wall of the server room, saying, "And this is where my team handles the technical stuff," a layer of sediment settled in my chest. It was heavy, and it was cold. I left the office at 2 a.m. The hallway on the executive floor was quiet. I walked past the timeline wall, a series of framed photographs documenting the history of Heliovantage. There was a photo from the very beginning. It was black and white, taken 20 years ago. It showed the four of us standing in front of the first small office building. Gregory was in the center, looking young and hungry. Lena, a toddler with bouncy curls, was clinging to his leg, looking up at him with a wide, demanding smile. He was looking down at her, laughing. And there was my mother, Elise. She stood slightly to the side. Her face was calm, her eyes looking straight at the camera lens with a knowing intensity. Her hand was not on Gregory. It was resting firmly on the shoulder of the tall, awkward girl standing next to her. Her hand was on me. I stood there in the dark hallway for a long time, staring at that photograph. My mother had known. Even then, she had known the fault lines of this family. She was not holding me back. She was steadying me. She was bracing me for the weight she knew I would eventually have to carry alone. I touched the glass of the frame, right over her hand on my shoulder, leaving a faint fingerprint. Then I turned and walked to the elevator, my heels clicking on the marble, ready to wake up in 4 hours and do it all over again. The catalyst for the collapse was named the Harbor Point Transit Modernization Project. In our internal projections, we simply called it the Whale. It was a municipal contract worth $45 million over 5 years, tasked with overhauling the entire digital infrastructure of the public transit system for our neighboring metropolis. It was the kind of contract that would not just double our revenue, it would graduate Heliovantage from a successful family business into a regional power player. For my father, it was the crown jewel he wanted to wear to his retirement party. For Lena, it was the stage she needed to prove she was a titan of industry. For me, it was a mathematical equation that I knew, within 5 minutes of the first meeting, was going to equal 0. We were sitting in a conference room that smelled of expensive cologne and municipal authority. The Harbor Point city manager, a man named Mr. Vance who wore a watch worth more than my car, leaned forward. "We need a seamless integration," Vance said. buses, light rail, ticketing apps, and maintenance scheduling, all talking to each other, real-time data, zero latency. The current system is a dinosaur. We need this live before the mayoral election. He looked at Lina. Can you deliver a fully tested, secure, city-wide integration in 6 months? He asked. I opened my mouth. My brain was already running the critical path analysis. To build the back-end architecture, secure the API endpoints, migrate 2 decades of legacy data, and run beta testing to ensure we did not strand 10,000 commuters in the rain. We needed 18 months. If we worked weekends and burned out half the engineering staff, we could do it in 12. 6 months was not a deadline. It was a hallucination. Before I could inhale, Lina smiled. It was her best smile, the one that made people feel safe while she picked their pockets. Absolutely, Lina said. 6 months is aggressive, but Heliovantage thrives on aggressive. We can have the ribbon cutting in October. Mr. Vance looked delighted. My father looked proud. I felt the bile rise in my throat. I kicked Lina gently under the table, a signal we had used since we were children. But she ignored me. She was too busy shaking hands on a promise that was physically impossible to keep. We returned to the office in a limousine my father had rented for the occasion. They popped champagne. I went straight to my desk and opened a new project file. I worked for 6 hours straight. I pulled the historical data from our last 3 major deployments. I factored in the size of the Harbor Point database. I calculated the necessary man-hours for coding, the mandatory security audits required by state law, and the inevitable debugging phase. I created a Gantt chart that looked like a roadmap to hell. The earliest possible delivery date, assuming nothing went wrong, assuming no one got sick, assuming the servers never crashed, was 14 months from today. Lina had sold them a fantasy at a 60% discount on reality. I printed the report. It was thick, heavy, and undeniable. I walked into the executive suite. Gregory and Lina were looking at color swatches for the marketing brochure. They were debating between cobalt and navy. They were discussing the font size for the press release. They were decorating a house that did not have a foundation. We cannot do it, I said, dropping the report on the table. It landed with a thud that silenced the room. Gregory sighed, not looking up from the swatches. Adeline, please, we are celebrating. I am not trying to ruin the party, I said, keeping my voice level. I am trying to keep us from getting sued for breach of contract. Lina promised 6 months. The math says 12, minimum. If we rush this, the system will crash. If the transit system crashes, the city loses money every second. We will be liable for damages that exceed the value of the contract. Lina picked up my report, flipped through 2 pages, and tossed it back down as if it were a tabloid magazine. You are always so dramatic. Adeline, she said, rolling her eyes. You just lack vision. You look at numbers and see walls. I look at them and see hurdles to jump over. The engineering team just needs to be pushed. They are lazy because you coddle them. I am not coddling them. I snapped, my control slipping. I am preventing them from writing garbage code because they haven't slept in 3 days. You cannot negotiate with an algorithm. Lina, it works or it does not. Gregory stood up. Enough. He walked over to the window, looking out at the skyline where the Harbor Point trains were currently running on their old, slow systems. Adeline, he said, his back to me, you have always been the cautious one, and I appreciate that. But this is the big leagues. We cannot go back to Vance and say we made a mistake. It makes us look amateur. It makes Lina look incompetent. She was incompetent. I wanted to scream, but I swallowed it. So we lie? I asked. We lie and hope a miracle happens? We innovate, Gregory corrected, turning around. His eyes were cold. You need to stop finding problems and start finding solutions. If you are not on board with the timeline, then perhaps you are not the right fit for this leadership team. The threat hung in the air, distinct and sharp. The next day, during the pitch rehearsal with the sales team, Lina escalated the narrative. She stood in front of the whiteboard, drawing arrows and circles. Now, she said to the team of junior account executives, I know Adeline has sent out some scary emails about risks and delays. She gestured to me where I sat in the corner. You can ignore those, she said with a dismissive wave. Our CTO likes to plan for the apocalypse. It is just her process. It is a bit of a downer, but do not let it affect your energy with the client. We are selling the dream, not the safety manual. The sales team laughed. They looked at me with pity. I was the buzzkill. I was the old maid of the corporation, clutching my pearls while Lena led the charge into the brave new world. I left the room. 5 minutes later, Gregory's assistant summoned me to his office. He was sitting behind his desk, rubbing his temples. He looked tired. He looked like a man who knew he was driving fast on a wet road but refused to take his foot off the gas. You are undermining her, he said softly. I am telling the truth, I replied. He looked at me for a long time. Then he played the card I knew was coming, the card he kept in his pocket for emergencies. Your mother built this company. Adeline, he said. I stiffened. She wanted this to be a legacy for both of you. He continued. She wanted you to take care of each other. Right now, you are making Lena look weak. You are tearing apart the family business because you have to be right. Is that what Elise would have wanted? Would she want you to sabotage the biggest opportunity we have ever had just to prove a point? The guilt washed over me, hot and suffocating. He knew exactly where to hit. He knew that my loyalty to my mother was the only thing keeping me in this building. I took a deep breath. I realized then that I could not stop the train. He was going to let Lena drive it off the cliff because he loved the way she looked in the conductor's hat. All I could do was make sure I wasn't tied to the tracks. Fine, I said. I will do it. I will push the team. I will build the architecture for a 6-month deployment, but I will not be responsible when it breaks. Gregory smiled, relieved. That is my girl. That is the team player I know. I am not finished, I said. I pulled a document from my portfolio. It was a single page. I had typed it up 10 minutes ago. It was titled Risk Assessment and Liability Acknowledgement, Harbor Point Project Scope. It listed 3 bullet points. 1. The timeline of 6 months is insufficient for standard quality assurance. 2. The accelerated schedule poses a high probability of critical system failure during peak operation. 3. The CTO has formally advised against this timeline and has been overruled by the CEO and Director of Strategic Relations. I slid it across the desk. I need you to sign this, I said. Gregory looked at it. He laughed, a short barking sound. What is this? A hall pass? It is for my records. I said, if we are doing this your way, I need it in writing that I advised you of the risks. It is just internal documentation. Standard procedure for high-risk deployments. I framed it as bureaucracy. I framed it as me being the boring, paper-loving administrator he always thought I was. He did not read it. He did not look at the liability clause. He just saw a piece of paper that stood between him and me getting back to work. He was so arrogant, so convinced that his charm and Lena's luck would solve everything, that he considered the possibility of failure to be zero. He uncapped his Mont Blanc pen. You and your paperwork, Adeline, he muttered. He scrawled his signature across the bottom line. It was a large, looping signature, full of confidence. He pushed the paper back to me. Happy? I picked it up. The ink was still wet. We will make it work, Gregory said, dismissing me. We always do. I walked out of his office with the document. I did not file it in the general project folder. I walked to my office, unlocked my personal safe, and placed the sheet of paper inside, right next to the silver bracelet I no longer wore to work. The project began the next morning, and it was exactly the disaster I predicted. The timeline was not just tight, it was a noose. My engineers were sleeping under their desks. We were cutting corners on code reviews just to meet the weekly milestones. And then came the emails. Every week, Lena would meet with Mr. Vance for lunch, and every week she would come back with a new promise. Subject: New feature. From Lena Bryan, Adeline Bryan. Addie, good news. Vance loves the idea of integrating the parking meters into the app too. I told him we could include that in the Phase 1 rollout. No extra charge. It's a value add. Make it happen. I stared at the screen. Integrating the parking meters was a completely separate database architecture. It was another month of work. She had just given it away for free and promised it in the same suffocating window. I replied, copying Gregory. Lena, we cannot add features. We are already behind on the core transit grid. This will crash the timeline. Her reply came 3 minutes later. Stop being so rigid. It's just a few sensors. Be flexible. I went to Gregory. He refused to look at the updated Gantt chart. We can't say no to the client now. Adeline, he said, irritated, just figure it out. That is why I pay you. The atmosphere in the office turned toxic. My team was exhausted and angry. They blamed me because I was the face of the demands. I was the one telling them they had to work Saturday again. I was the one canceling their vacations. Lena, meanwhile, was glowing. She was being profiled in local business magazines as the woman transforming Harbor Point. She walked through the office like royalty, oblivious to the smell of burning circuits and human misery in the engineering wing. 2 weeks before the suspension, we had a status meeting. We were missing milestones. The beta test had failed 3 times. Lena sat at the conference table and threw me to the wolves. We are behind because engineering is dragging its feet, she told the assembled department heads. I promised the client agility, and Adeline is giving them bureaucracy. I am trying to expand the relationship, and she is counting pennies. I looked at Gregory. I waited for him to defend the reality of the situation. I waited for him to say that his other daughter had promised a spaceship when we only had parts for a bicycle. I am concerned. Adeline, Gregory said, looking at me with cold eyes. It feels like you are looking for reasons to fail. If you mention risk to the client one more time, I will have to consider disciplinary measures. We need unity, not sabotage. I looked at the man who had raised me. I looked at the sister who was cannibalizing my life to feed her ego. I realized then that the signature in my safe was not just insurance. It was an exit strategy. I just didn't know when I would use it. I didn't say a word. I just nodded, wrote down disciplinary threat in my notebook, and noted the time, 10:14 in the morning. The countdown had begun. They just didn't hear the ticking. Walking back to my desk to collect my things felt less like leaving a job and more like walking out of a simulation. The hum of the office, a sound that had been the background radiation of my life for a decade, suddenly felt artificial. I walked past the rows of desks where engineers I had hired were typing furiously, their faces illuminated by the blue light of code that I had architected. They knew, in an office like Heliovantage, news travels faster than data packets. I could feel their eyes darting toward me and then snapping back to their screens. A junior developer named Sarah, whom I had mentored through her first major deployment, started to stand up as I passed. She looked like she wanted to say something, perhaps to ask if the rumors were true, but I gave her a microscopic shake of my head. Stay down, I commanded silently. Do not attach yourself to a sinking ship. She hesitated, then sat back down. I reached my office. It was a glass box, transparent and exposed, just like everything else in this company. I did not pack a box of personal effects because I did not have any. There were no framed photos of vacations I never took. There were no potted plants I had time to water. I took 3 things. I took my laptop, which contained the encrypted keys to the kingdom. I took my security badge, a piece of plastic that had granted me access to the building at 3 in the morning for years. And I opened my safe and took out the single sheet of paper titled Risk Assessment and Liability Acknowledgement, signed in bold, arrogant ink, by Gregory Bryan. I walked out. I did not look at the executive suite. I did not look at the timeline wall. I walked through the lobby, past the receptionist who was pretending to be very interested in her phone, and stepped out into the parking lot. The sun was shining. It felt offensive. I drove to my townhouse on the edge of Ashford Ridge. It was a quiet place, purchased with the money I had saved by never having a social life. The interior was gray and white, minimalist to the point of being clinical. It was the only space in the world where I could control the variables. I sat at my dining room table. The wood was cool under my hands. I laid out the items I had brought home like evidence in a private trial. The badge, the laptop, the document. I sat there for a long time, listening to the silence of the house. It was different from the silence in the conference room. That had been the silence of tension. This was the silence of a vacuum. I felt untethered. For 20 years, my gravity had been defined by the needs of heliovantage. Without it, I was just a woman sitting in a gray room with a piece of plastic and a signed confession. I opened the laptop. Technically, I was suspended, not fired, so my credentials still worked. My inbox was a crime scene. There were 12 emails from the engineering team, marked high priority. Adeline, HR says you are out? Who is signing off on the daily build? Adeline, the Harbor Point API is throwing errors. What do we do? Adeline, please tell me this is a joke. I felt a phantom twitch in my fingers, the reflex to reply, to fix, to soothe. I forced my hands into my lap. I was not the mechanic anymore. Let the machine grind to a halt. There was an email from Human Resources, sent 5 minutes after I left the building. Subject: Suspension Protocols and Asset Return. Body: Dear Ms. Bryan, per the CEO's directive, your access to company systems will be revoked at 5 this afternoon. Please arrange for the courier return of all company property. It was a form letter. They hadn't even bothered to customize it. Then I saw it. An email from Marjorie Hale. It had been sent 2 minutes after I walked out of the conference room. The subject line was stark. Something you need to see. I clicked it. There was no text in the body of the email, just an attachment, a PDF file named Silverline Trust Executed 2014. PDF. I opened the file. It was a scan of a legal document, yellowed slightly at the edges, even in digital form. It was a trust agreement established by Elise Bryan 3 months before she died. I began to read. The legalese was dense, but the logic was crystalline. My mother had placed her 40% share of Heliovantage into a dormant trust called Silverline. For years, the voting rights of these shares had been assigned to Gregory, keeping him in control. But there was a clause, Clause 7A, the trigger event. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. In the event that the beneficiary, Adeline Bryan, is removed from her operational duties or executive position by the trustee, Gregory Bryan, for reasons other than proven professional negligence, criminal misconduct, or voluntary resignation, the voting rights of the Silverline shares shall immediately and irrevocably revert to the beneficiary. I read it again and again. My mother had known. She had looked at her husband, looked at her youngest daughter, and then she had looked at me. She knew that one day, Gregory's need to be the hero and Lena's need to be the star would collide with my need to be the anchor. She knew they would try to cut me loose to save their own buoyancy. She had built a trap door under them, and she had given me the key, hidden in a legal document that Gregory had likely signed without reading, just like he signed everything else. But there was a catch. I needed to prove that my suspension was not due to professional negligence. Gregory's narrative in the boardroom was that I was being suspended for damaging the company image and undermining leadership in a court of law. That could be argued as cause. He could claim I was toxic. He could claim I was the problem. My eyes drifted from the screen to the piece of paper sitting on my dining table. Risk assessment and liability acknowledgement. I picked it up. The CTO has formally advised against this timeline. The accelerated schedule poses a high probability of critical system failure. And at the bottom, Gregory's signature. By signing this document, Gregory had legally acknowledged that I was doing my job. He had acknowledged that my assessment was professional, detailed, and accurate. He had signed off on the fact that I had warned him. If he suspended me for negativity regarding a project that he had acknowledged in writing was high risk, then he was not firing me for negligence. He was firing me for competence. He was punishing me for professional diligence. The suspension was the trigger. The document was the proof. I let out a breath that I felt I had been holding since the funeral. My phone sat on the table. I picked it up and dialed Marjorie's personal number. She answered on the first ring. "You read it," she said. It was not a question. Her voice was dry and calm, the voice of a woman who had been waiting a decade to make this phone call. "I read it," I said. "Did he know?" "Gregory?" Marjorie let out a short, sharp sound. Elise tried to explain it to him. He nodded and patted her hand and told her not to worry about legal details. He put the envelope in his desk and forgot about it. He thought it was just a standard inheritance allocation. He never believed he would actually do it. Adeline. He never believed he would choose Lena over the company's survival. He thought he could have both. "He made his choice today," I said. "Yes," Marjorie agreed. "And now you have to make yours. Do you have the document?" "What document?" I asked, though I knew. "The risk assessment," she said. "The one Lena complained about in the hallway. The one she said you forced him to sign." "I have it," I said. "It is on the table in front of me." "Good," Marjorie said. "I have already alerted Daniel Reyes. He is the attorney who drafted the trust for your mother. He is expecting you at his office at 7 tomorrow morning. Bring the laptop. Bring the badge. Bring the paper." "Marjorie," I asked, my voice steady, "what happens when we trigger this?" "Chaos," she said simply. "The board will panic. Harbor Point will ask questions. But the math is on your side. Adeline, with the Silverline shares and my vote, you have 51%. You become the majority voice. You can fire him. You can fire her." I looked out the window. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn of my complex. "I do not want to destroy the company," I said. "Then you have to save it from them," Marjorie replied. "Get some sleep. You are going to need to be sharp tomorrow. The ghost of your mother just handed you a sword, my dear. Do not be afraid to swing it." The line went dead. I sat in the darkening room for another hour. I watched the streetlights flicker on. I did not feel the crushing weight of depression I had expected. I did not feel the sting of rejection. I felt a cold, hard resolve settling into my bones. I walked to the kitchen and made a sandwich. I ate it standing over the sink. Then I went upstairs, showered, and laid out my clothes for the next morning. Not the gray blazer I usually wore to blend in. I chose a navy suit, sharp and tailored, the kind of suit a CEO wears. I lay in bed. I closed my eyes. For the first time in years, I did not worry about the server load. I did not worry about Lena's latest promise. I did not worry about Gregory's disappointment. I thought about the silver bracelet tucked away in my drawer. Wear this when you build something bigger than all of this. I realized I was not just building a system anymore. I was rebuilding the truth. I fell asleep instantly. It was a deep, dreamless sleep. The sleep of a soldier who knows exactly where her weapon is and exactly when she is going to use it. The next morning, I would not be the daughter. I would be the shareholder. And that was a language Gregory Bryan understood, even if he had forgotten how to speak it. The office of Daniel Reyes smelled of old leather and expensive silence. It was located on the 14th floor of a building 3 blocks away from Helio Vantage, close enough to see the logo on the skyline, far enough to be outside its blast radius. At 7 o'clock in the morning, the city was just waking up. But Daniel looked as if he had been awake for a century. He was a man of precise movements, the kind of lawyer who treated words like ammunition. He never wasted one. He spread the documents out on his mahogany desk, the suspension email from Human Resources, the scanned copy of the Silverline Trust Agreement, and finally, the original risk assessment and liability acknowledgement with Gregory's wet signature at the bottom. Daniel adjusted his reading glasses. He read the suspension email. Then he read the risk assessment. He did it twice. "This is remarkably careless of him," Daniel said, his voice devoid of surprise. "He suspended you for conduct detrimental to company unity immediately after signing a document where you professionally identified critical liabilities, legally. He has validated your competence in the same breath he used to fire you for your attitude." He looked up at me. "The trigger clause in the Silverline Trust is specific. It protects you against arbitrary removal that is not based on professional negligence. This risk assessment? He tapped the paper with a manicured finger. This proves you were not negligent. You were the only one who was diligent. By suspending you for this, he has legally defined his own actions as a breach of the fiduciary duty he owes the trust. So it holds? I asked. It holds, Daniel said. He slid a thick stack of papers across the desk. These are the transfer documents. Once you sign these, the voting rights for the 40% of shares held in the trust revert immediately from Gregory to you. Combined with Marjorie Hale's 12%, you will control the majority vote of the board. I picked up the pen. It was heavy. My hand did not shake. He does not know yet, I said. No, Daniel replied. The notification goes out the moment the clerk stamps this, which will be in about 2 hours. Until then, Gregory Bryan thinks he is still the king. I signed my name, Adeline Bryan. The ink soaked into the paper, dark and permanent. Done, Daniel said, taking the papers back. Congratulations, Ms. Bryan. You just acquired a company. While I was sealing Gregory's fate in a quiet office, the theater was beginning at Helio Vantage. At 8:30, Lena walked into the lobby. She was wearing a new suit, a soft lavender color that suggested approachability in springtime. She held a latte in one hand and her phone in the other. She did not look like an executive who had just lost her chief technical officer. She looked like a woman who had just undergone a detox. She stopped at the reception desk. "Good morning, Jessica," she said to the receptionist, offering a tired, brave smile. "If anyone asks, I am in meetings all morning. Yesterday was difficult, but we have to make the tough choices to keep the culture healthy, right?" Jessica, who had feared for her job every day since Lena took over, nodded vigorously. "Of course, Ms. Bryan, you look great. By the way." "Thank you," Lena sighed, heading for the elevators. "Self-care is so important when you are under attack." She rode the elevator up, basking in the glow of her own narrative. She believed the problem was solved. The negative energy was gone. Now she could finally work without me breathing down her neck about math and physics. The elevator doors closed. 15 minutes later, at 8:45, the automatic glass doors of the lobby slid open again. This time, it was not a family member. It was 4 people, 3 men and 1 woman, all dressed in charcoal suits that cost more than my car. They carried briefcases that looked heavy. They did not smile. They walked to the reception desk with the synchronized purpose of a firing squad. "Good morning," the lead man said. He was tall, with gray hair and eyes that looked like they could scan a barcode from across the room. "I am Marcus Thorne, lead auditor for the Harbor Point Oversight Committee. This is my team." Jessica blinked. Do we have an appointment?" "We are here for the unscheduled milestone compliance check," Thorne said. "Per the contract stipulations regarding the Phase 1 integration, we need to see the current server logs and the security encryption keys immediately." He paused, looking around the lobby. "Please summon the Chief Technical Officer," he said. "We need to speak with Adeline Bryan. Her signature is on the protocols, so she is the only one authorized to release the data." Jessica froze. Her eyes darted to the phone. She knew the gossip. Everyone knew the gossip. Jessica stammered. "Ms. Bryan she is not in today." "Is she sick?" Thorne asked, his voice sharpening. "We have a strictly scheduled window." "She is unavailable," Jessica said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Get the CEO," Thorne said. It was not a request. Upstairs, the panic began to spread like a virus. Jessica called the executive assistant. The executive assistant ran into Gregory's office. Gregory was in the middle of a call with a vendor, laughing. "Mr. Bryan," the assistant hissed, her face pale. "Harbor Point auditors are downstairs. They are asking for Adeline." Gregory dropped the phone. "What? Why are they here?" "Compliance check. They say they need the encryption keys. They say only the CTO can authorize it." Gregory stood up, smoothing his jacket. "It is fine. Get Lena. Tell her to go down there and charm them. Tell her to handle it. They specifically asked for Adeline, the assistant said. Just get Lena, Gregory snapped. Down in the lobby, Lena stepped out of the elevator. She had reapplied her lip gloss. She walked toward the auditors with her hand extended, her smile bright enough to blind a satellite. Gentlemen, and madam, she beamed. I am Lena Bryan, Director of Strategic Relations. My sister is taking a little personal time today, but I would be more than happy to walk you through our vision for the next phase. Marcus Thorne did not take her hand. He looked at her as if she were a pop-up ad he was trying to close. Ms. Bryan, Thorne said coolly, we are not here for vision. We are here for technical compliance. We need the route access logs for the transit grid. We need to verify that the latency is under 50 milliseconds as promised in the contract for this week's milestone. Right, Lena said, her smile faltering slightly. Well, our engineering team can certainly get you some data. If you will just step into the conference room, I can order some coffee. We do not want coffee, the woman next to Thorne said. She held up a tablet. According to your own organizational chart, the only person with route access clearance is Adeline Bryan. If she is not here, who is monitoring the live feed? We have a team, Lena stammered. We have many capable people. Who is the acting CTO? Thorne demanded. Lena looked at the receptionist. She looked at the elevator. She realized, for the first time, that strategic relations did not give her the password to the mainframe. I am handling the leadership transition, Lena said, trying to sound authoritative. So there is no CTO on site? Thorne asked, pulling out a red pen and making a mark on his clipboard. During a live integration phase? That is a level 1 breach of contract. At 9:15, the digital bomb detonated. On the top floor, in the plush boardroom where the other 5 members of the board were gathering for an emergency meeting Gregory had called to explain my departure, phones began to buzz. It was a synchronized vibration. Bzzzt, bzzzt, bzzzt. Marjorie Hale, sitting at the end of the table, opened her iPad. She already knew what was there, but she opened it for effect. The email was from Daniel Reyes. Subject: Notice of Voting Rights Transfer. Silverline Trust. Attached to the email were the documents I had signed an hour ago, but there was more. Marjorie had attached the risk assessment, and she had attached a timeline comparison. Lena's promise versus Adeline's reality. A bald board member named Gerald read the email. His face went from pink to white. Gregory, Gerald said, his voice trembling. Did you sign a liability acknowledgement admitting the project was high risk? Gregory, who had just walked in to take his seat at the head of the table, looked confused. What? I signed some internal paperwork Adeline badgered me about. It was meaningless. It was not meaningless, Marjorie said, her voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. You admitted the risk in writing. Then you suspended the only person trying to mitigate it. You triggered the Silverline clause. Gregory, you just handed the company to her. That is ridiculous, Gregory scoffed. Elise would never... It is done, Gerald said, holding up his phone. The transfer is registered. She has the shares. She has the majority. And, another board member added, looking out the window, there are federal auditors in the lobby, and your other daughter looks like she is about to vomit. I was sitting in my car across the street. I had tinted windows. I could see the glass facade of Helio Vantage Systems. It was a beautiful building. My mother had picked the location. She liked the way the morning light hit the steel. I saw the frantic movement in the lobby. I saw the silhouette of Gregory pacing in the boardroom window on the 4th floor. I saw the flashing lights of the server status board through the 2nd floor glass. It had turned from green to yellow. The system was straining. Usually, this would be the moment I ran. For 20 years, my reflex was to fix. If there was a fire, I was the water. If there was a crack, I was the cement. My body wanted to open the car door, sprint across the street, type in my override code, and stabilize the server before the auditors saw the latency spike. But I sat still. I watched the yellow light turn to red. I watched my father's legacy start to shake. I remembered the look on Lena's face when she smiled at my suspension. I remembered Gregory telling me to be reasonable while he erased me from the narrative. I was done being the glue that held their delusions together. I checked my watch. It was 9:30. The auditors would be demanding to see the CEO by now. The board would have read the documents. The reality of the situation would be setting in. They were not just missing an employee, they were missing the keys to the car, and the car was doing 100 miles an hour toward a brick wall. I opened the car door. I stepped out onto the pavement. The air was crisp. I smoothed the lapels of my navy suit. I adjusted the silver bracelet on my wrist. I did not run. I walked. I crossed the street with a steady, measured pace. I was not rushing to put out a fire. I was walking in to inspect the ashes. I reached the front doors. The security guard, a man named Sam, who had known me since I was an intern, looked at me with wide eyes. He had heard I was suspended. He looked at my badge, which technically should have been deactivated, but he didn't move to stop me. He opened the door. "Morning, Ms. Bryan," he whispered. "Good morning, Sam," I said. I walked into the lobby. The noise stopped. Lena was standing near the elevator, cornered by Marcus Thorne. Her face was flushed, her hands trembling. Gregory had just come down, looking disheveled and frantic. The auditors looked ready to write a citation that would end the company. Then they saw me. "Adeline," Gregory shouted, relief washing over his face. He actually took a step toward me, his hands reaching out. "Thank God. You need to explain to these people." He stopped. He saw the suit. He saw the way I was standing. He saw that I was not holding a laptop to fix his problem. I was holding a folder of legal documents. "Ms. Bryan," Marcus Thorne said, turning to me, "we were told you were suspended." I looked at Marcus, then I looked at Gregory, then I looked at Lena. I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent lobby. But that was before the majority shareholder decided to make a change in management. I walked past them toward the elevator. "Where are you going?" Lena cried out, her voice shrill. I pressed the button. "To the boardroom," I said. "We have a vote to conduct." The elevator ride to the executive floor took less than 30 seconds, but it felt like a decompression chamber. When the doors slid open, the hallway was deserted. The assistants were gone, likely hiding in the break room or trading panicked text messages about the auditors downstairs. I walked toward the main boardroom. The double glass doors were frosted, blurring the figures inside into gray shapes, but the voices were clear enough. I pushed the doors open. The conversation inside died instantly. Gregory was standing at the head of the table, his face a mottled shade of crimson that clashed violently with his silk tie. Lena, who had managed to scramble up the stairs or take the freight elevator to beat me here, was sitting to his right. She looked pale, her chest heaving as if she had just run a marathon. Marjorie Hale sat on the left, her hands folded over a stack of files, her expression unreadable. The other 4 board members looked like passengers on a plane that had just lost an engine, terrified and looking for a parachute. I did not take my usual seat in the back corner. I walked to the empty chair at the opposite end of the table. Directly facing my father, I placed my laptop, the trust documents, and the signed risk assessment on the mahogany surface. Gregory did not wait for me to sit. "You have some nerve. Adeline," he spat out. The venom in his voice was thick. "You bring lawyers into this? You bring up your mother's will? You are turning this company into a battlefield because you cannot handle a simple disciplinary action." He slammed his hand on the table. "This is a betrayal," he shouted. "You are weaponizing your mother's legacy against your own father. I suspended you for the good of the family, to give us time to heal. And you respond by trying to steal the company?" I looked at him. I did not blink. I waited for him to finish panting. "I am not stealing anything. Gregory," I said, my voice low and steady, "I am enforcing the rules you agreed to." I slid the risk assessment down the long table. It spun across the polished wood and stopped right in front of him. "You signed that yesterday." I said, "You acknowledged in ink, that the Harbor Point timeline was high risk. You acknowledged that I advised you against it, and then, less than 24 hours later, you suspended me for being negative about the very risks you formally accepted. Gregory looked at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. "That was just paperwork," he yelled, waving a hand dismissively. "It was just something to get you to shut up and do your job. It means nothing." "In a court of law," I replied, "it means everything. It proves that my suspension was not based on professional negligence. It proves it was personal. And that distinction is exactly what triggered the Silverline Trust." Lena leaned forward, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and indignation. "You are ruining everything!" she shrieked. "You orchestrated this. You purposefully made the client panic with your technical jargon so you could blame me. You are jealous. Adeline, you have always been jealous because Dad trusts my vision more than your spreadsheets. You are trying to sabotage the Harbor Point deal just to prove you are right." She turned to the board members, her eyes wide and pleading. "She is toxic," Lena insisted. "She is the reason the auditors are downstairs. She probably called them. She wants to burn this company down just to hurt us." I did not answer her. I simply looked at Gerald, the board member who handled the audit committee. Gerald cleared his throat. He looked uncomfortable. He picked up a sheet of paper from the pile Marjorie had distributed. "Actually, Lena," Gerald said, adjusting his glasses, "we have a record of the internal communications regarding the project." He began to read. "From Lena Bryan to Gregory Bryan. Date, November 12th. Subject, Adeline's drama. Dad, ignore Adeline's email about the security protocols. She's just being dramatic to slow us down. I promised Vance we would have biometric login by phase 1. It is a great selling point. Just tell her to do it and stop whining about encryption standards." Gerald looked up. The room was silent. He picked up another paper. "From Lena Bryan to Harbor Point City Manager. Date, November 14th. Mr. Vance, do not worry about the integration delays mentioned by our technical team. That is just internal noise. I guarantee personal oversight to ensure we hit the October launch." Gerald placed the papers down. He looked at Lena with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "You waived security protocols on a municipal transit system to sell a feature we do not have," Gerald said. "And you put it in writing. That is not vision. Lena, that is gross negligence." Lena's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She looked at Gregory, waiting for him to save her. But Gregory was staring at the emails. The wall of denial he had built was showing its first crack. "I did not send those emails to the board," I said softly. "Marjorie did, because Marjorie reads the server logs." Before Gregory could respond, the large monitor on the wall flickered to life. It was the video link to the Harbor Point conference room. We were scheduled for a crisis update, and the connection had auto-dialed. The face of Mr. Vance appeared on the screen. He did not look happy. Beside him sat Marcus Thorne, the auditor who was currently downstairs, dialing in from his mobile device. "Mr. Bryan," Vance said. His voice filled the room, amplified and distorted by the speakers. "My auditors tell me there is no CTO on site. They tell me your daughter Lena tried to block access to the server logs." Gregory stood up, putting on his best salesman smile, though it looked ghastly on his pale face. "Mr. Vance, please," Gregory said. "It is a misunderstanding. We are undergoing a slight restructuring. Adeline is taking a leave of absence, and Lena is stepping up to—" Vance cut him off. "Let me be clear. Gregory," Vance said, "the only reason I have not terminated this contract for cause this morning is because of the risk reports Adeline Bryan has been filing." The room went deadly still. Gregory blinked. "What?" "Adeline has been sending weekly transparency reports to our technical oversight team," Vance explained. "She documented the delays. She documented the risks. She was honest about the fact that your timeline was impossible. Because of her honesty, we knew what to expect. We knew she was the only adult in the room." Vance leaned into the camera. "If she is gone," Vance said, his voice dropping to a growl, "then the trust is gone. And if the trust is gone, the contract is void. I want a competent engineer running this integration, not a marketing major who promises magic. Fix this, or my legal team will own your building by Friday." The screen went black. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. Gregory slowly sat down. He looked like a man who had walked into a glass door he had spent 20 years pretending was not there. He looked at Lena. All those times he had praised her for closing the deal. All those times he had dismissed me as the naysayer. He realized now, with a sickening clarity, that the money had stayed on the table only because I had been under the table, holding the legs steady while they danced on top of it. "You knew?" Gregory whispered, looking at me. "You told them we were failing?" "I told them the truth," I corrected. "And because I told them the truth, they did not sue us for fraud when we missed the first deadline. I saved you, Gregory, again." Marjorie Hale spoke up then. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of history. "Elise knew this would happen," Marjorie said. Gregory turned his head slowly to look at her. "Elise came to me 3 weeks before she died." Marjorie continued. "She told me that she loved you, Gregory, but she said that when it came to Lena, you were blind. She said you saw Lena as a reflection of your own vanity, and you saw Adeline as a piece of machinery." Marjorie took off her glasses. "She asked me to join the board for one reason," Marjorie said, to wait for the day you lost your way completely. She set up the Silverline Trust not to hurt you, but to stop you from destroying what she built. She knew that eventually, you would try to push Adeline out to protect Lena's ego, and she knew that would be the end of Heliovantage. Gregory looked down at his hands. He looked at the empty chair where his wife used to sit during the early days. The board members were exchanging glances. The calculation was simple. On one side, a $45 million contract that depended on me. On the other side, a CEO and a director who had lied to the client and alienated the technical staff. "There is a motion on the table," I said. I tapped the folder of transfer documents. "I control 40% of the voting shares. Marjorie controls 12. That is 52%. The majority has shifted." Gregory looked up. The shock was fading, replaced by a desperate, frantic bargaining. He realized he could not win on logic. He could not win on numbers. So he tried to win on the only currency he had left. "Adeline, wait," he said. He stood up and walked toward me. He stopped a few feet away, holding his hands out in a pleading gesture. "We can fix this," he said, his voice trembling with a forced warmth. "We do not need to do this with lawyers and votes. We are a family. We can resolve this right here, in this room." He looked at the board members, offering a shaky smile. "I was stressed," Gregory said. "I made a rash decision yesterday. I admit it. I should not have suspended you. I will reinstate you immediately. In fact." He paused, his eyes darting around as he improvised. "I will promote you, Executive Vice President of Innovation. How does that sound? You will have your own budget. You can hire whoever you want. We will give you a corner office." He reached out to touch my shoulder, the same way he used to when he wanted me to do his taxes or fix his Wi-Fi. "You just stop this trust business," he whispered. "You return the shares to my voting block. We put out a press release saying we are a united front. Lena will apologize. We will all go out to dinner. Family first, right?" I looked at his hand hovering near my shoulder. I looked at the title he had just invented, Executive Vice President of Innovation. It sounded grand. It sounded important. It was completely empty. It was a title with no operational authority. It was a bribe. He was offering me a golden cage so he could keep the keys. He was willing to give me a fancy name, but he was not willing to give me respect. He still wanted to control the vote. He still wanted to be the one who decided when I was useful and when I was in the way. I stood up. I stepped back, out of his reach. "I am not interested in a title, Gregory," I said, "and I am not interested in dinner." I looked at the board members. "I am interested in operational competence. I am interested in solvency. And I am interested in ensuring that this company exists next week." I turned back to him. "Your offer is rejected. The shares have already transferred. The vote is happening now. The large monitor at the end of the room flickered again. The connection to the Harbor Point crisis team cut out, replaced instantly by the stark, sterile background of Daniel Reyes's office. Marjorie Hale had set this up. She had the timing of a conductor leading a symphony. Daniel appeared on the screen. He was sitting perfectly still, his hands clasped on his desk. He did not look like he was interrupting a board meeting. He looked like he was presiding over a sentencing. "Good morning, members of the board," Daniel said. His voice was smooth, devoid of any theatrical inflection. "I am Daniel Reyes, executor of the Silverline Trust, established by the late Elise Bryan in 2014. Gregory was breathing hard, staring at the lawyer. "You have no business here," he stammered. "This is a private company meeting." "It is a shareholder meeting," Daniel corrected him gently, "and as of 9 o'clock this morning, the shareholder landscape has changed." Daniel held up a document to the camera. "Clause 7A of the trust agreement," he read, his eyes scanning the text. "The activation clause. It states that if the beneficiary, Adeline Bryan, is removed from her executive duties by the trustee, Gregory Bryan, without documented proof of professional negligence or malfeasance, the voting rights of the 40% stake held in trust shall automatically revert to the beneficiary." He lowered the paper. "We have received the suspension order issued by Gregory Bryan yesterday," Daniel continued. "We have also received the risk assessment signed by Gregory Bryan yesterday. The juxtaposition of these two documents creates a legal certainty. Gregory Bryan acknowledged Adeline Bryan's professional competence in writing, then removed her for personal reasons. That action constitutes a breach of his fiduciary duty to the trust." "That is a technicality," Gregory shouted, standing up again, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Elise would never have agreed to that. She trusted me. She would never have set a trap for me in her own will. You are twisting her words." Daniel did not argue. He simply looked down at his keyboard and pressed a key. "I anticipated this objection," Daniel said. "Mrs. Bryan anticipated it too." The screen changed. Daniel's face disappeared. The image that replaced him was grainy. It was recorded on a webcam from over a decade ago. The lighting was soft. Coming from a desk lamp I recognized immediately. It was my mother's home office. Elise Bryan appeared on the screen. She looked tired. Her hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and she was wearing a thick cardigan she used to wear when the chemotherapy made her cold. But her eyes were clear. They were sharp. The room went silent. It was a silence so profound that I could hear the hum of the air conditioning unit on the roof. "Hello, Gregory," the video Elise said. Gregory let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. He collapsed back into his chair, his hand covering his mouth. "If you are seeing this," my mother continued, looking directly into the lens, "it means you have lost your way. It means you have done exactly what I feared you would do." She paused, taking a sip of water. Her hand shook slightly. "I love you, Gregory," she said. "But I know you. I know that you have a blind spot the size of an ocean when it comes to Lena. You want her to be brilliant so badly that you will pretend she is, even when the evidence says otherwise." On the screen, she leaned forward. "And I know that to protect that illusion, you will eventually try to silence Adeline, because Adeline is the mirror that shows you the truth, and you hate the truth when it isn't pretty." I felt a lump form in my throat, hot and hard. I had never seen this video. I had never known she saw me this clearly. "So," Elise said, her voice firming up, "I am leaving Adeline a shield. This trust is not to punish you, Gregory. It is to stop you. If you push her out to save Lena's ego, this company stops being yours. It becomes hers, because she is the one who will make sure there is still a company left for our grandchildren." She smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "Trust her, Gregory, like I do." The video cut to black. For 10 seconds, no one moved. Gregory sat slumped in his chair. He looked small. The arrogance that had fueled him for 20 years had evaporated, leaving behind an old man who had just been scolded by the ghost of the only woman he had ever respected. He looked at the black screen, tears streaming silently down his cheeks. He was not crying because he had lost the company. He was crying because he realized he had broken his wife's heart 10 years after she died. The company's general counsel, a man named Peters who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. He looked at the papers Marjorie had distributed. He looked at the black screen. "The legal standing is solid," Peters said, his voice quiet. "The trust activation is valid. The voting rights have transferred." He turned to the board. Adeline Bryan now controls the majority block, 40% from the trust, plus Marjorie Hale's 12%. She holds 52% of the voting power. The reality of the math hit the room. It was over. There was no debate. There was no negotiation. Lena, who had been staring at the screen in shock, suddenly seemed to realize that the shield of her father's protection had just disintegrated. She looked at Gregory, who was broken. She looked at me, who was holding the sword. Panic, raw and ugly, twisted her face. "This is not my fault," she blurted out. Everyone turned to look at her. "He let me do it," Lena shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Gregory. "He is the CEO. It was his job to check the contracts. I told him I wanted to impress the client, and he told me to go for it. He never told me to stop. He never told me I couldn't promise those dates." She stood up, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "I am a victim here too," she cried. "He set me up to fail. He knew I didn't understand the technical side, and he just kept clapping. Why didn't he stop me? Why didn't he protect me?" It was a display of breathtaking narcissism. In her desperate attempt to survive, she was cannibalizing the very man who had spent his life shielding her. Gregory looked up at her. The pain in his eyes was excruciating. He was watching his golden child, the one he had sacrificed everything for, tear him apart to save her own skin. "Lena," Gregory whispered, his voice cracking, "I did everything for you." "Well, you didn't do enough," she snapped, "because now I am going to lose my job because of you." Marjorie Hale slammed her hand on the table. "Enough," Marjorie said. Her voice was like a whip. "Sit down, Lena. You are embarrassing yourself." Lena sat, bursting into angry, terrified tears. The board members looked at each other. They were practical people. They had families to feed and reputations to protect. They looked at the broken CEO. They looked at the hysterical director. And then they looked at me. "Adeline," Gerald said. He spoke respectfully now. The condescension was gone. "You hold the cards. The Harbor Point contract is hanging by a thread. The auditors are downstairs waiting for an answer." He leaned forward. "What is your intention? Are you going to dissolve the board? Are you going to liquidate the assets? Is this revenge?" I looked at them. I looked at the timeline wall behind them, with the photo of my mother. I could burn it down. I could fire everyone in this room. I could sell the assets to the highest bidder, take my millions, and walk away, leaving Gregory and Lena with nothing but their debts. It would be poetic. It would be justified. But that would mean destroying the thing my mother built. That would mean firing the 300 engineers who had done nothing wrong. That would mean proving that I was just as emotional and reckless as they were. "No," I said. I stood up straighter. "I am not here to destroy Heliovantage," I said. "I am here to save it. But to save it, we have to cut out the infection." I opened my folder and took out a single sheet of paper. I had typed it in Daniel's office an hour ago. "I have 2 motions," I said, "and I am using my majority share to call for an immediate vote." I placed the paper on the table. "Motion 1, I said, my voice ringing clear in the silent room. "The immediate removal of Gregory Bryan as Chief Executive Officer, effective this minute." Gregory flinched, but he did not speak. He just stared at the table. "Motion 2, I continued. "The immediate termination of Lena Bryan as Director of Strategic Relations for cause, specifically gross negligence and misrepresentation of company capabilities." Lena let out a gasp, but Marjorie glared her into silence. "And," I added, looking at Gerald, "Motion 3, the appointment of an interim Chief Operating Officer, to be selected from an external firm approved by the Harbor Point Oversight Committee, to restructure the project and ensure compliance. I looked at the board members. This is the only way Mr. Vance keeps the contract. I told them, he needs to know the old guard is gone. He needs to know that the people who lied to him are out of the building. If we do not do this right now, the auditors downstairs will shut us down by lunch. Gerald looked at the other board members. He nodded slowly. It is the only way, Gerald agreed. Then we vote, Marjorie said. All those in favor of the motions proposed by the majority shareholder? Marjorie raised her hand. I raised my hand. That was 52%. The vote was mathematically decided. But then, Gerald raised his hand. Then the woman next to him raised hers. One by one, every single member of the board raised their hand. It was unanimous. They were not voting for me out of love. They were voting for survival. They were voting for the person who had the math on her side. The motions carry, Marjorie said softly. She turned to Gregory. Gregory, she said, her voice gentle but final. You are relieved of your duties. She turned to Lena. Lena, you are terminated. You will need to hand over your badge and your company phone immediately. The silence that followed was the sound of a guillotine blade hitting the block. It was done. The reign of the Bryans, the version of it built on charm and favoritism, was over. Gregory stood up slowly. He looked older than his 60 years. He looked at me, his eyes searching for something. Forgiveness, perhaps, or anger, but he found neither. He found only a mirror reflecting his own failures. He did not say a word. He turned and walked toward the door, his steps heavy and shuffling. Lena, however, was not going quietly. She stood up, her face streaked with mascara, her hands balled into fists. You cannot do this, she screamed at me. I am your sister. You are supposed to support me. I am supporting the company, I said calmly, and the 300 families that depend on it. That includes you, Lena, because if this company goes under, your trust fund goes with it. She stared at me, her mouth open. She hadn't even thought about the money. Now, I said, pointing to the door, please leave the boardroom. We have a crisis to manage, and we cannot have unauthorized personnel in the meeting. It was the same line she had used on me 100 times. You are not authorized. You are not invited. She looked at the board members. No one met her eyes. She looked at Gregory's retreating back. She realized she was alone. With a sob of pure frustration, she grabbed her purse and ran out of the room, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind her. I let out a breath. My hands were still steady, but my heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked at the empty chair at the head of the table, the CEO's chair. I did not sit in it, not yet. I turned to the board. Call Marcus Thorne, I said. Tell him he can come up. Tell him the encryption keys are available, and tell him the timeline has been corrected. Gerald picked up the phone. I walked over to the window and looked down at the street. I saw Gregory walking out of the front entrance, alone. A moment later, Lena followed, looking frantically for her car. They looked small from up here. They looked like just two people in a parking lot, stripped of the power they had wielded so carelessly. I touched the silver bracelet on my wrist. Wear this when you build something bigger than all of this. We are just getting started, I whispered to the reflection in the glass. The silence in the boardroom was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a structure that had lost its load-bearing walls. Gregory stood near the door, his hand hovering over the handle, looking back at me with an expression that shifted from shock to a curdled, desperate anger. He looked like a man who had woken up in a house he did not recognize. You cannot do this, Gregory said. His voice was shaking, but it was rising in volume, trying to fill the room with the authority he no longer possessed. You cannot do this to your own family. Adeline, I am your father. I raised you. I gave you a job when you were just a shy girl who couldn't look people in the eye. He took a step back toward the table, his face flushing a deep, unhealthy red. He was trying to summon the patriarch, the moral shield he had used to deflect every criticism for 30 years. "We are blood," he said, hitting his chest with a clenched fist. "You are embarrassing us in front of strangers, in front of the employees. For what? For power? Is this what you want? To humiliate the man who put clothes on your back?" I watched him. I felt a strange detachment, as if I were watching an actor perform a monologue I had memorized a decade ago. "You did not give me a job, Gregory," I said. My voice was quiet, but in the acoustic perfection of the glass-walled room, it sounded like a judge's gavel. "You gave me a burden. You gave me the mess you didn't want to clean up." "I gave you a home," he shouted. "I kept this family together." "Did you?" I asked. I walked around the table, closing the distance between us. I did not stop until I was standing 3 feet from him. "Do you remember the day I got my acceptance letter for the master's program at MIT? It was the same day as Lena's engagement party to that boyfriend she broke up with 2 months later." Gregory blinked, confused by the shift in timeline. "What does that have to—" "I put the letter on the dining table," I continued, relentless. "I wanted to show you. I wanted you to be proud, but the caterers came in to set up for Lena's party. Someone put a linen napkin over my letter to make room for the centerpiece. You sat at that table for 4 hours, drinking champagne, toasting Lena's future, and you never even lifted the napkin. You threw my future in the trash with the cake crumbs because Lena needed the table space." "That is petty," Lena snapped, stepping up beside Gregory. Her face was splotchy with tears, but her eyes were venomous. "You are holding a grudge about a napkin? That is why you are stealing the company? You are pathetic. Adeline, you are just jealous. You have always been jealous because I am the one people actually like." She turned to the board members, gesturing wildly at me. "She is doing this out of spite," Lena yelled. "She tricked Mom into writing that will. She manipulated the situation because she can't stand that Dad loves me more. She is stealing Heliovantage." I looked at my sister. She was 30 years old. But in that moment, she was still the 9-year-old girl faking a cry to get out of doing her homework. "I am not stealing the company," I said. "I am salvaging it." I walked back to my spot at the head of the table. I picked up a second folder. It was thick, black, and bound with a red elastic band. "And I am not jealous, Lena," I said. "I am auditing you." I dropped the folder on the table. It landed with a heavy, dull thud. "What is that?" Lena asked. Her voice lost its sharp edge, replaced by a sudden, hollow wariness. "That," I said, opening the cover, "is a summary of your expense reports for the last 18 months. I pulled out a sheet of paper covered in highlighted rows. "Last July," I read aloud, "a 5-day stay at the Four Seasons in Napa Valley, 2 suites, spa treatments, wine tours, total cost, $12,400. You listed it as client development, West Coast expansion, but I checked the CRM logs. We do not have a single client in Napa, and the only people tagged in your social media photos from that weekend were your sorority sisters." The color drained from Lena's face so fast she looked like she might faint. I was networking," she stammered. "You don't understand how business works. Adeline, you have to spend money to—" "October," I interrupted, reading the next line. 3 designer handbags purchased from a boutique in Milan, $7,000, listed as executive gifts for Harbor Point stakeholders. I checked with Mr. Vance's office. They have a strict no-gift policy. They never received them, but I did see a very nice unboxing video on your personal Instagram account the next day." I looked up at the board members. They were no longer looking at me with apprehension. They were looking at Lena with the cold, hard eyes of people who realized they were sitting next to a liability. "There are flights," I continued, flipping the pages. "First class to Paris for a conference that didn't exist. Dinners at Michelin star restaurants where the guest list was just you and your friends. In total, over the last fiscal year, you have embezzled approximately $150,000 of company funds under the guise of marketing expenses." The word embezzled hung in the air like smoke. "That is a lie," Lena shrieked, but her voice was thin. Dad approved those. Dad signed off on them. She turned to Gregory, clutching his arm. Tell her you said it was okay. You said I needed to look the part. Gregory looked at the spreadsheet on the table. He looked at the board members, who were now whispering to each other. He saw the trap closing. If he admitted he approved them, he was complicit in fraud. If he denied it, he was throwing Lena to the wolves. Gregory started, his voice raspy. I did not look at every receipt. I trusted her judgment. Lena gasped, pulling away from him as if he burned her. You liar! You told me to put it on the company card. This is not just a policy violation, I said, my voice cutting through their squabble. This is tax fraud. This is misappropriation of corporate assets. If I hand this folder to the Harbor Point auditors downstairs, or to the IRS, this becomes a criminal investigation. Gerald, the board member, wiped sweat from his forehead. Adeline, he said quietly, if this gets out, the reputation damage, the legal fees. I know, I said, which is why I have a proposal. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out 2 documents. They were standard separation agreements, but with an addendum I had drafted myself the night before. I am offering you a way out, I said to Gregory and Lena. A quiet way out. I slid the papers across the table. You will both sign these resignation letters immediately. I said, you will agree to a full release of claims against the company, and you, Lena, will sign a promissory note agreeing to repay the $150,000 over the next 5 years, with interest. Repay it? Lena whispered. I don't have that kind of money. I spent it. Then you will get a job, I said. A real one. And if we don't sign? Gregory asked. He was trying to sound defiant, but he just sounded tired. Then I give this folder to the authorities, I said. And I let the board sue you for breach of fiduciary duty to recover the losses. You will lose your pension. Gregory, you will lose the house, and Lena will likely face prosecution. Gregory looked at me, his eyes filled with tears again, but this time he played his final card, the one he always saved for the end of the world. Adeline, he choked out, your mother, Elise, she would be heartbroken. She wanted us to be together. She wanted peace. How can you use her legacy to destroy her husband and daughter? How can you sleep at night knowing you put your own sister in jail? He was using my mother's ghost as a human shield. It was the same manipulation he had used since the day she died. I felt a flash of white-hot anger, but I tamped it down into a cold, hard resolve. Do not speak for her, I said. My voice was low, dangerous. You do not get to use her name to hide your crimes anymore. I walked over to the timeline wall and pointed to the photo of Elise. Mom was not a fool. Gregory, she was a mathematician. She knew that numbers don't lie. But people do. Honoring her memory isn't about letting you pretend everything is fine while you rob the company she built. Honoring her means doing exactly what she prepared me to do. I turned back to them. She gave me the sword because she knew you wouldn't have the courage to cut out the rot, I said. I am doing exactly what she asked. I am saving the foundation. I pointed to the papers. Sign them, I commanded. Or I call the police. You have 2 minutes. The room was deathly quiet. The board members held their breath. Lena looked at the folder of evidence. She looked at the grim faces of the board. She realized, for the first time in her life, that no one was coming to save her. Her charm had run out. Her father's protection had evaporated. The reality of prison, of public shame, of losing everything, crashed down on her. Her arrogance broke. It shattered into a million pieces of raw fear. I can't go to jail, she whimpered. Dad, do something. Gregory stood frozen, paralyzed by his own pride. Lena looked at me. She saw the stone wall in my eyes. She grabbed the pen from the table. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely hold it. I'll sign, she sobbed. I'll sign. Just don't call them. She scribbled her name on the resignation letter. She scribbled her name on the repayment agreement. She pushed the papers away from her as if they were contaminated, then buried her face in her hands. I looked at Gregory. "Your turn," I said. He looked at Lena, broken and sobbing. He looked at the company he had ruled for 20 years. He realized that if he didn't sign, he would not only lose the company, he would lose the last shred of dignity he had left. He would be the man who went to prison for his daughter's handbags. He picked up the pen Lena had dropped. He did not look at me. He looked at the signature line. "I hope you are happy, Adeline," he whispered. "You won. You are the queen of the ashes." "It is not ash, Gregory," I said. "It is concrete. You just never bothered to check." He signed. The scratch of the pen against the paper sounded like a scream in the quiet room. He stood up, leaving the papers on the table. He did not look back. He walked to Lena, touched her shoulder, and mumbled, "Come on." Lena stood up, wiping her eyes, her makeup smeared into a mask of tragedy. She didn't look at me. She couldn't. I picked up the papers. I checked the signatures. They were valid. "Gerald," I said, handing the documents to the board member, "file these with HR and legal immediately, then notify Marcus Thorne that the leadership restructuring is complete." I looked at the door where my father and sister were exiting the frame of my life. "And cancel their parking passes," I added. "Effective immediately." The email notification hit every inbox in the building simultaneously at 11 o'clock. Subject: Mandatory all-hands meeting. Location: Main atrium. Time: immediate. It was the kind of email that usually signals a layoff or a merger. The sound of 300 chairs scraping against the floor on the engineering level vibrated through the steel beams of the building. People moved toward the elevators in a herd, their faces tight with anxiety. They knew the auditors were here. They knew the servers had been flashing red all morning. They knew the Bryans were at war. I stood behind the frosted glass partition of the mezzanine, watching them fill the atrium below. It was a sea of gray and blue suits, a collective organism holding its breath. In the past, this was Lena's moment. She would have had the lighting team adjust the spots to catch her hair just right. She would have walked out to upbeat music, holding a microphone like a pop star, dazzling them with buzzwords until they forgot they hadn't received a raise in 2 years. Today, there was no music. There was no lighting crew. There was just the cold, natural light pouring in from the skylights, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I walked down the stairs. The sound of my heels on the marble was the only noise in the cavernous room. 300 heads turned. They looked at me. Then they looked behind me, expecting to see Gregory or Lena leading the way. But I was alone. I walked to the small podium that had been set up in the center of the room. I did not smile. I did not wave. I placed my hands on the edges of the lectern and leaned forward. To my right, standing near the security desk, were Gregory and Lena. They were not on the stage. They were in the shadows, flanked by the Human Resources Director and Sam, the head of security. Lena looked as if she were trying to shrink into the drywall. Gregory stood rigid. His jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle jumping from 50 feet away. I adjusted the microphone. It gave a short, sharp squeal of feedback that made everyone flinch. "Good morning," I said. My voice echoed. It was not the smooth, practiced voice of a public speaker. It was the voice of the person who wrote the code. It was technical, direct, and unvarnished. "For the past 3 years," I continued, looking directly at the engineering team clustered near the front, "Heliovantage Systems has operated on a deficit. I am not talking about money. We have plenty of money. I am talking about a deficit of truth." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. No one had ever used the word truth in a town hall meeting before. Usually, it was synergy or optimization. "We have allowed the desire for growth to outpace the laws of physics." I said, "We have sold products that did not exist. We have promised timelines that required you to sacrifice your health and your families to meet. We have treated technical constraints as suggestions rather than realities." I paused. I saw Sarah, the junior developer, nod her head slowly. I saw the lead architect cross his arms, listening intently. "That ends today," I said. I looked over at Gregory. He was staring at the floor. "As of this morning, the board of directors has voted to restructure the leadership of this company. We are returning to our core competency. We are going to be an engineering firm again, not a marketing firm that happens to sell software." I took a breath. Effective immediately, those who ignored internal warnings and prioritized image over functionality no longer hold decision-making power at Heliovantage. "We are initiating a leadership transition." I did not say their names. I did not have to. Every eye in the room darted to the two figures standing by the security desk. The realization hit the room like a physical wave. The king was dead. The princess was dethroned. The architect had taken the keys. I gestured to a man standing quietly to my left. "This is Mr. David Aris," I said. "He is an operations specialist recommended by the Harbor Point Oversight Committee. He will be serving as our interim chief operating officer to help us reorganize the transit project timelines. He understands that code takes time. He understands that you cannot negotiate with a server crash." David stepped forward and gave a brief, respectful nod. He did not try to steal the show. He knew whose moment this was. The room was still focused on me. They were waiting for the other shoe to drop. They were waiting for me to scream, to gloat, to act like a Brian. But I simply closed the folder in front of me. "The era of miracles is over." I said, "We are going back to work. Thank you." I stepped back from the podium. There was no applause. It was not that kind of meeting. It was something heavier, more significant. It was the sound of 300 people exhaling at the same time. Then the movement began. The human resources director nodded to Sam. Sam, a man who had opened the door for Gregory every morning for 15 years, stepped forward. He did not look happy, but he did his job. He gestured toward the main glass doors. Gregory and Lena began to walk. It was a long walk. The atrium was vast, a cathedral of glass and steel that my mother had designed to feel open and welcoming. Now, it felt like a gauntlet. The employees instinctively parted. They created a wide, silent corridor down the center of the lobby. No one spoke, no one jeered. They just watched. They watched the man who had founded the company walk out with a box of personal items in his hands. They watched the woman who had claimed to be the face of the future walk out with mascara running down her cheeks, clutching her purse like a shield. I walked down the steps of the podium and followed them, keeping a distance of 10 paces. I needed to see them out. I needed to lock the door. Gregory reached the threshold of the revolving doors. The sunlight outside was blinding, a stark contrast to the cool, controlled climate of the office. He stopped. The automatic sensor did not trigger because he was hesitating. He turned around. He looked past the security guard. He looked past the hundreds of employees watching him. He looked straight at me. "Adeline," he said. His voice was low, trembling with a mixture of grief and a last, desperate attempt at manipulation. It echoed slightly in the vestibule. "Family is the most important thing. Adeline, family is everything. Do you remember?" It was the phrase he had used to silence me when I was 12. It was the phrase he had used to steal my credit when I was 20. It was the phrase he had used to suspend me yesterday. It was the leash he had wrapped around my neck the day I was born. The lobby went deathly still. Everyone heard it. They waited to see if the leash still held. I looked at him. I looked at the man who had chosen his ego over my reality every single day of my life. "I remember," I said. My voice was clear, carrying to the back of the room. I took a step closer, standing on the Heliovantage logo embedded in the floor. "And that is exactly why I am doing this, Gregory. I am not allowing anyone to use the word family to hide their favoritism ever again. You broke this family long before I broke this company. I am just sweeping up the glass." Gregory flinched as if I had slapped him. The moral high ground he had tried to claim crumbled beneath his feet. He realized, finally, that the definition of family he had enforced, one where I sacrificed so Lena could shine, was not a law of nature, it was a lie, and I had stopped believing in it. He turned away, his shoulders slumping. He pushed through the revolving door, stepping out into the heat of the parking lot. Lena lingered for a second longer. She turned her head. Her eyes were red, rimmed with hate. She looked at me. Then she looked at the engineers standing behind me. "You will fail," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You are boring. Adeline, you are invisible. This company runs on charisma. It runs on sales. You will collapse in a month without me to sell the vision. No one follows a calculator." She spun around, her heels clacking angrily against the glass, and followed her father into exile. The doors spun to a stop. I stood there, staring at their retreating backs. They were walking toward their cars, two small figures in a vast concrete lot. They looked ordinary, without the title of CEO, without the title of director, without the backdrop of the building I kept standing. They were just two people who had spent more money than they earned. The silence in the lobby stretched out, tense and electric. Lena's words hung in the air like a curse. No one follows a calculator. Then, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I did not turn around immediately. I kept my eyes on the glass. "Excuse me, Ms. Bryan?" It was a male voice, hesitant, but respectful. I turned slowly. It was the lead system architect, a man named Marcus, who had been with the company for 8 years. Behind him stood Sarah. Behind her stood the entire back-end development team. They had moved forward, closing the gap that Gregory and Lena had left. They were not looking at the door. They were looking at me. They were not looking at me with pity, or with fear, or with the glazed adoration they used to give Lena. They were looking at me with expectation. "We preserved the server logs you asked for," Marcus said, clutching a tablet, "and we have a patch ready for the latency issue on the Harbor Point grid. But we need authorization to deploy it. The old protocols required Lena's signature, but, well..." He paused, looking at the empty door, then back at me. "What are your orders, boss?" he asked. I looked at them. I looked at the tired faces of the people who actually built the things my family took credit for. I felt the weight of the silver bracelet on my wrist. Wear this when you build something bigger than all of this. I was not invisible. I was structural. And for the first time, the structure was visible. "Deploy the patch, Marcus," I said, "and then order lunch for the whole floor. On the company card. We have a lot of work to do." A ripple of relief, genuine and palpable, went through the crowd. Shoulders relaxed. People began to turn to each other, talking low and fast about code, about schedules, about the work. The paralysis was broken. The machine was restarting. I turned back to the glass doors one last time. Gregory and Lena were getting into their cars. I saw brake lights flare red. I saw them pull away, merging into the traffic of Ashford Ridge, disappearing into the stream of ordinary life. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel happy. Happiness was a fleeting thing, like a balloon at a party. What I felt was something heavier, something colder, and infinitely more permanent. I felt absolute. I placed my hand against the cool glass of the door, right where my reflection met the outside world. I was standing in the exact center of the empire my mother had dreamed of and I had built. The leash was cut. The ghost was at peace. I stood there, watching the dust settle in the empty parking lot, listening to the hum of my company coming back to life behind me, and for the first time in 30 years, I did not apologize for taking up space. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Adeline and her fight for justice. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from. I would love to hear your thoughts on the ending. If you enjoyed this, please make sure to subscribe to the Lila Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and smash that hype button so more people can hear this story. See you in the next one.